everyone, and welcome back to the Love Like Crazy podcast. We're your hosts, Jay and Stacy Coleman, and we've traveled from Louisiana all the way to Florida to the Hi Hello Labs studio where we are filming today. And so we're excited to be here in Florida. We're enjoying ourselves.
The weather is gorgeous.
The weather
here.
is fantastic. The temperature has dropped, and it is so nice to not be in the heat like we've experienced over the summer.
We're used to hot and humid in Louisiana, and I know that the temps here in Florida are very similar, but you're right, the temperatures have definitely dropped, and it is nice, cool. This is a word that we don't use very often in Louisiana. It's very crisp. It's very crisp outside.
Oh, I agree with that adjective. It
feels very fallish.
It does. And today we are going to approach a topic that honestly, Jay, I do not necessarily feel that comfortable talking about, but I know that it is needed. And we're going to talk a little bit about sexual sin,
sexual
temptations, and that's what we're going to talk about. I'm going to let you.
Let me take it because I'm very comfortable talking about this topic.
Yeah, I know you are.
And
but
I know
I do want to add in, from here.
Well, we were both brought up very similar with a very conservative, background, very, reserved. But I'm assuming that probably because the amount of counseling that I've done and having to spend time with couples, walking through things that have brought destruction of their marriage through the years, I've gotten to where I'm very comfortable talking about this subject.
Right. I think for me, though, you're right. My upbringing, the conservative background, it's just not a topic that's openly discussed.
Yeah.
But I think that it needs to be discussed, and even in the church, we don't talk about it as much as we should. And so, on this episode, we really do want to dig into this and give our listeners something to think about.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that because quite honestly, whenever it comes to dealing with sexual sin or even within a marriage, healthy sexual relations, for the most part, the church has been silent. And
I agree.
It's sad to say, but we've let the world kind of lead in this area.
Right.
And when sexual sin occurs, a lot of times we want to sweep it under the rug, or we want to stand in judgment of people instead of really helping them walk through something and be healed. For far too long, we've kind of stood in judgment in that area. And so today, hopefully in this episode, it'll help bring some strength, some life to your marriage, maybe kind of open your eyes to some areas that you were not aware of. Now, before we jump into this, I want to echo what you were saying, people joining to be a part of this podcast. And thank you so much for being a part of this, listening to the podcast. If you like what you're hearing, then do us a favor, help us to get the word out, because your likes, your sharing this, the different comments that you leave for us, it helps to power this podcast. And it helps to get the word out to other people, your friends, your neighbors, people that you're in relationship with, or maybe even people you don't know, but it helps us to get the word out there. So help us move this podcast forward. And thank you so much for being a part of Love Like Crazy.
Yes.
Now, you might say, why are you talking about this topic today? Well, when you get into Scripture and you begin to study, you begin to read different areas, a lot of people are unaware that the Bible has a lot to say about sex. Whenever I do premarital counseling, I always ask couples, one of the times that we do in premarital counseling is healthy sex life. And I always ask couples, I say, are you aware that the Bible has a lot to say about this subject? And they always say, absolutely not. Being raised in the church, a lot of times they think the Bible doesn't really have a lot to say. Well, honestly, it does. Why would it not? Because God is the one who actually created sex to be shared within the confines of marriage. Now, a lot of people are familiar with Ephesians chapter 5, and there's a verse that I'm going to throw out there in Ephesians 5 where it talks about the wife submitting to the husband. And a lot of people are familiar with that verse. A lot of women get salty about that verse. But if you read on in Ephesians chapter 5, you get close to the end of the chapter. It says in verse 33, it says, each one of you, speaking of the husband and wife, must love his wife as he loves himself, and the wife must respect her husband. In other words, it's talking about the husband showing love to his wife. It's talking about the wife being respectful and being loving towards the husband. And that love and respect goes a long ways towards both. Wives should be respectful to their husbands. Husbands should be respectful to their wives. And you should flow in love towards one another. Well, guess what? That translates from not just a physical act within the bedroom to an emotional act between you two, where you're growing together physically, you're growing together emotionally, And in my opinion, you're growing together spiritually as well.
So what you're saying is, as long as the wife feels loved by her husband, she has no problem submitting and showing respect towards him.
Absolutely. And the words you use there, I think a lot of times that talking about submitting, that raises a lot of ladies, whenever it comes to that, they get up in arms about that because the
That's
husband
true.
has been more physical to his
Mm-hmm.
wife and expecting her to respond instead of tending to her needs emotionally,
Mm-hmm.
spiritually, mentally, physically, all those different areas. But it's my opinion that if we are taking care of our wife emotionally, then they are going to want to respond to us physically,
Absolutely.
and they are also going to want to show that respect to us as well.
I agree.
So, am I headed in the right direction here?
You are. This is good.
So let's dig more into that physical mindset, because a lot of times within the marriage, now in this podcast, a lot of this is going to be directed towards men, because I am a man and I know how men think, I know how men respond, I know how men feel. And so quite honestly, a lot of what we're going to deal with within this podcast, I'm going to direct it towards men, because honestly, I think that men need to be challenged in this area. A lot of times there's sexual sin within men's lives, and here's the mindset. Well, I didn't do anything, so it's okay for me to look at that. It's okay for me to interact with this person, and there may be an emotional connection. There's not a physical connection, but there's an emotional connection. But the bottom line is this: all of it's sin. It's things that we need to run away from, because it actually helps to tear our marriage down, and it helps to bring destruction within our marriage. Now, you might say, well, why are we talking about this today? What is the big deal about sexual sin? And we're going to go at it from the aspect of this. I heard a minister say this years ago, and it kind of stuck with me. I don't remember who it was, but they talked about affair-proofing your marriage. And so that's kind of the direction that I want to
Affair-proofing our marriage.
head in today, because a lot of times there's things that take place. An affair takes place within a marriage, and it causes destruction to take place. A marriage falls apart, a family falls apart, a reputation falls apart, and it's never good. It's not something that brings health or life within our families. And you guys know that this podcast is all about building a stronger family, building a stronger marriage. And so here's some statistics for you that actually were kind of troubling to me. Statistically, 29% of men have had 15 or more sexual partners. 9% of women have had sex with 15 or more men. So what we're discovering is that there's an issue in this world, an issue within America, with sexual sin. And a lot of times we look at those things and we think that it's not that big of a deal, but infidelity actually has affected 80% of marriages. And it could go beyond a physical affair. It may be an emotional connection. It may be looking at images online, interacting with pornographic images online, looking at different things you should not be looking at, and it causes issues within the marriage. Now, the man would say, hey, what's the big deal? I'm looking at something here. It's not hurting her at all. But I'm just going to tell you, man to man, when your wife finds out that you are looking at things online that you should not be looking at, it actually makes her feel defiled. Would you agree with that?
Yes.
And you're bringing issues within that marriage and expectations within that marriage as a husband, as a man, that, let's be honest here, your wife is not going to be able to fulfill. And so it causes all types of issues within the marriage. So we want to deal with that today. Paul actually tells us in 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 18, he says, run from sexual sin. This is an area that we should look at, we should be aware of, and we actually should be in the mindset of running away from it. Sadly, a lot of times we're running towards it. We're looking for things. We have the door open towards temptation, and it can cause all kinds of problems within the marriage. So Paul very emphatically says that. He says, run from sexual sin, for no other sin so clearly affects the body as this one does. For sexual immorality is a sin against your own body. He says, don't you realize that your body is a temple of the Holy Spirit who lives in you and was given to you by God? You do not belong to yourself. So I'm going to go back to actually that very first mindset of running from sexual sin. And today we're going to deal with sexual immorality in a way to where it doesn't really affect our marriage. Now, before we jump into this, I do want to say this. If you fall into the category, and I know I'm hogging the conversation here.
Okay.
Are you okay with that?
Go ahead.
Since I know you said as we got into this, you're not as comfortable talking.
I'm not as comfortable talking about this topic, but I do want to add in, guys, I know that you're talking directly to the men also, but I want to let you know that whenever you're talking about the men, they don't think it's a big deal, whatever. It's truly feeding into your wife's insecurities.
Yeah.
And that in itself is not taking care of her emotionally whatsoever. And so I definitely think that needs to be pointed out. I don't think men realize just how damaging that can be
I agree
to
with
their
you.
life.
Well, let me say this, guys. You need to continually be building your spouse up. As much as you're building them up, there's a very real spiritual enemy tearing them down. A lot of times your wife looks in the mirror, she is, judging herself and saying things about herself. And sometimes just we're immature, we're stupid, and we kind of feed into that. We joke a little bit and feed into that, and it helps kind of tear them down a little bit. So I agree with you 100%. I'm glad you brought that up, that a lot of times if you're doing things online, whether it's pornography, whether it is talking
looking at other women or what those type of things,
or even
another way.
interacting with women on social media, it feeds into those insecurities. And so don't do those kind of things. And I think it kind of brings up the first mindset that we're going to talk about here today. And it's if you want to build your marriage and you want to help safeguard your marriage against any type of affair, whether it's emotional, whether it is physical, the very first mindset that you need to have is, hey, I'm going to live by God's standards. I'm going to honor the Lord with my marriage. I'm going to honor the Lord with everything that I do within this marriage. And I want to say this, I'm not condemning you if you have sinned in the past. If you have repented, you're moving forward from that. God can heal you. God can heal your marriage. And I do want to point this out again, that if you fall into the category of having fallen into sexual sin, maybe you've looked at some stuff. Maybe you as a husband or you as a wife have actually stepped outside of the marriage. A lot of people through the years in the counseling that we've done, unfortunately, a lot of times this does lead to divorce. This actually is the third most cited reason for divorce in America is sexual sin. There is hope for you, though. A lot of times people think this is it, that cheated, I'm done. But if you are fully committed to that marriage and you love your spouse and you say, hey, I messed up, you repent, you allow God to change you. And here's what I would tell you, get counseling, whether it's going to see your pastor, whether it's going to see a professional counselor. There is hope for that marriage. And I have watched this happen time after time after time, that God has healed a marriage. God has brought it back from the brink of divorce.
And brought restoration.
But here's how that happens. It always happens from you as a spouse looking at yourself and saying, what are the ways that I can allow God to change me, to be the spouse to you that you need to be? As long as you're both doing that within the marriage, it is helping to bring strength, hope, and life into the marriage. So let's talk about that first mindset of living your life and making sure that your marriage, you're going to honor God in your marriage. You're going to live by those standards. And I would say this, the Bible tells us that sex is to be shared within the confines of marriage, not outside of marriage. And I would say this, in that mindset, a lot of couples within the world that we live in, they cohabitate. A lot of couples that we live in the world that we do, even if they're not living together, they're having sex outside of marriage. And truth be told, God has called us to honor sex within the confines of marriage. In fact, you look at Proverbs chapter 5, verse 15, it says, drink water from your own well, share your love only with your wife.
So in other words, we should have eyes only for our spouse.
I love it. You should have eyes for your spouse only. And I'm glad you said that, because that is one of the things through the years that I've prayed. I think that every person on the face of the earth, the enemy knows what buttons to push. He knows how to get at you. And guys, let's be honest here. We're more physically driven. Women are more emotionally driven when I'm talking about sexually. And so it is very easy to let your eyes wander. And so one of the things I began to pray, probably after about 10 to 15 years of marriage, I heard another minister, he prayed this, and I'm like, I grabbed a hold of that. And I've prayed throughout the years, Lord, I thank you that you give me eyes only for my wife. Now, that does not mean that, if a pretty woman walks by that you don't maybe look, but here's the thing, you got to get a hold of your mind. You have to get a hold of your eyes and say, no, and Lord, I thank you that you give me eyes only for my wife, and you're going to flow in that and walk in that. And that's just something that I've prayed. That's something I've spoken through all these years. And I will tell you that Now you would say, hey, you're a little biased in this. My wife is the most beautiful woman on the face of the earth.
Oh,
And I tell her that all the time. I'm going to say this to you.
thank you, baby.
You're welcome. I love you.
Love you too.
Uh, we're getting a little cheesy today, but you need to tell your wife that on a everyday basis. I tell my wife numerous times every day how beautiful she is. I tell my wife numerous times every day just that she is the most wonderful woman on the face of the earth. And we actually did an episode some back talking about dealing with conflicts. That doesn't mean that we're not going to argue and have disagreements and whatnot, but even in those times whenever maybe you're walking through frustrations, you still need to speak positive things to each other. So
and this goes for the women as well.
Yeah.
So you're mainly talking to the men, but I just want to say it's for the women as well.
Yeah. So let me move forward, because once you make that decision, hey, we want to live our lives by God's standards, then you're going to bring that into the marriage, that God's standard is your standard. And if you are listening to this podcast, you're engaged, you're dating, you're single, whatever, make the determination. We're not going to fall into sexual sin. And somebody would say, hey, what is sexual sin? Well, sexual sin is any type of sex outside of the marital relationship. The Bible calls sex before marriage fornication. The Bible calls sex with somebody that is not your spouse. If you're married and you're having sex with somebody who is outside of the marriage, then that's adultery. Then we also have the subject of homosexuality, these different areas of sexual sin. When we make the determination that we're going to live our life by God's standards, then we are going to choose to enter into the confine of marriage, the covenant of marriage, one man, one woman. You're going to step into the covenant of marriage, and you are going to choose to have sexual relations only with your spouse. So once you choose to live your life by God's standards, when the enemy wants to come against you to bring sexual temptation, this is something that I think will cause you to arrest that. And it's this, to think of the consequences. Every time you are tempted sexually, think of the consequences of that. You might say, well, what does that look like? I'm going to fall off into this sexual relationship with somebody else and it's going to be amazing. No, it's not. It's not. It's going to be amazing for a moment, okay?
Ultimately, it could cost you everything.
Yeah, sin always looks great in the moment. I'm snapping my fingers because just that quickly that sin is over with, and you have to deal with the consequences. What are the consequences? It will come out eventually. Your reputation will be wrecked. You will be known as an adulterer. It will devastate your spouse. It will devastate your children. For me, within the office that I hold pastorally, I always think of what would it do to the congregants within our church? How would it affect our church as a whole?
It would be a snowball effect.
It would be a snowball effect, and it would affect our staff. It would affect so many people. So you have to think about those types of things when you think of a sexual sin. Proverbs 6:32 says, "But the man who commits adultery is an utter fool, for he destroys his own soul." You're affecting not just your world, you're affecting the world of so many other people.
Isn't it kind of like the saying, the grass is greener on the other side?
Yep.
But it's not really. You need to be watering your own grass.
Yeah.
Your own yard.
Well, I think that you hit the nail right on the head with that so many times you're looking over the fence and thinking, oh, it looks so amazing over there.
Yeah.
And it's kind of funny because we're actually in a drought right now in Louisiana. My yard looks absolutely horrible. But the good news about that is everybody's yard looks horrible. So in regards to your marriage, quit looking at the neighbor's yard and start looking at your own yard.
It's so much better. Yeah.
I know that for us, it is easy for us to fall into that mindset of looking at other people's marriages and thinking, hey, we got issues within our marriage. We're squabbling. We're fussing. Everybody else's marriage always looks so amazing. Yeah. When the truth of the matter is everybody always has work to do within their marriage.
Right.
So quit looking around and start working on your marriage.
Yeah, stop comparing.
Which brings me to the next thing. If you want to safeguard your marriage, first of all, choose to live your life by God's standards. The next thing is you got to continually build your marriage.
I agree.
I know that this podcast we've talked, it's all about building a stronger marriage, building a stronger family. But if you are in a growing relationship with your spouse, that is going to reduce the chance of you falling into adultery, falling into an affair, falling for sexual temptation that the enemy is going to bring your way.
Because if you're focusing on meeting the needs of your spouse, then you're safeguarding.
Well, let me say this. you brought that up. If you're focused on meeting the needs of your spouse, as long as I'm focused on meeting your needs, then guess what? Your needs are being met. Then what are you doing? You want to reciprocate, and you want to focus on meeting my needs as well. And so we are very selfish as people. A lot of times it's all about me, myself, and I. Well, what about my needs? Can't focus on that. As long as a husband, I'm focused on meeting your needs, taking care of you, then you are going to reciprocate. Get out of the selfish mindset. Quit thinking about yourself. Quit thinking about me, myself, and I, and start focusing on your spouse. Remember what we looked at in Ephesians chapter 5, talking about loving one another, talking about respecting one another. As long as we are flowing in that and we are continually working to build our marriage, and I'm focused on you and you're focused on me, then it's going to lead to a healthy and strong marriage.
When we're focused on each other, our eyes are for only our spouse. So we're not tempted to look elsewhere.
Yeah. You are in that mindset of Lord, give me eyes for my spouse only. Here's some needs. And we were recently talking to a good friend of ours who she is a marriage counselor. She is a family counselor. And she was talking about the top needs. And a lot of these things actually fall within the mindset of, that cause somebody to look outside of the marriage. The top 5 needs for men were sexual fulfillment, recreational companionship, an attractive spouse, and domestic support and admiration. For the woman,
let me tell you what for the women.
Okay, go for it.
We need affection, conversation. We want honesty.
Okay.
Which comes along with the communication. We've talked about that often before on other episodes. Women also want financial support.
Cha-ching.
Cha-ching. Financial support and knowing that their needs are going to be taken care of. And then the family commitment.
Okay.
That's the most important for women.
Well, it's funny because notice there, you said for the wife, affection was first. For the man, sexual fulfillment is first.
Yeah.
And a lot of times we equate, well, I am being affectionate towards her, so surely, there should be something in that for me. How about this? How about if we just give affection just for the sake of giving affection? And you cannot have the mindset of, hey, I'm going to give you a hug, or I'm going to hold your hand,
strings attached,
or I'm going to rub your back with strings attached to it. Okay. Right. As long as you are meeting her needs emotionally, then probably what is going to happen is she will be at the place where she's going to meet your needs physically. So as long as, once again, we're going to go back to this, as long as I'm taking care of you and I'm being the spouse to you that you need me to be, then you're going to reciprocate right back. So continually work on, build that marriage. Now, with that said, these top 5 needs, here's the top couple reasons for divorce. Communication. That is always top of the list for reasons why people get divorced. Lack of communication. Number 2 is financial issues. Number 3 is sexual issues. So think about the top 5 needs that men and women have, and then think of the top 3 reasons for divorce. And I know I'm throwing a whole lot of information out there, but with that in mind, these kind of all feed into one another. So a lot of information for you guys to think about. You're going to live your life by God's standards. You're going to be at the place where you're thinking about the consequences. If I choose to fall for sexual temptation, these are the consequences. It'll wreck my marriage. It'll wreck my reputation. It'll wreck my kids. And then I'm going to choose to build my marriage on a continual basis. I'm going to work on it. I'm going to grow it. How do you build your marriage? By allowing God to work on you. We've said this in past episodes. I really, as a man, whenever I begin to mature and lay down the selfishness, and my prayers turned into, God, change me to be the spouse that Stacy needs me to be, that's whenever the marriage really began to thrive and grow. And I know that was, you were doing the same thing on your side of the equation as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. And, talking about thinking about the consequences, I think that there needs to be the awareness of the severity of the consequences that can occur if there is some type of sexual sin, some adultery, stepping outside the marriage, because it leaves permanent scars.
It does.
And it's so damaging, not only to the marital relationship, but it trickles down to your children, other family. It's affecting on so many different levels. So that in itself, just understanding the severity of it and then intentionally saying, I know that's not going to be us, and we're going to work on our marriage and build our marriage to protect it.
Yeah. Well, I want to move to the next mindset,
Okay.
because we're talking about building that marriage, making it stronger. But the next thing we're talking about safeguarding our marriage against affairs, against sexual temptation. The next thing is you got to get a hold of your mind,
Hmm.
because think about this: you're not just this moral, upstanding person one day and you just, oops, I fell into sexual sin. No, sin is always a process. Falling into an adulterous relationship is always a process. It does not just happen overnight. I know that we see these things on television programs and whatnot, that it just, it just happened. That's not what typically takes place. When you look into scripture, you see things like James. He talks about how the process of sin. James chapter 1, he says, but each person is tempted when they are dragged away by their own evil desire and enticed. Then after desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin, and sin, when it's full grown, gives birth to death. What he's trying to help you understand there is a process. Think of this. Where does the process of falling into sexual sin start? In our mind.
In our minds, right.
We always have these different thoughts. We always have these different things that the enemy puts in our mind. And slowly over the course of time, it makes its way down into our heart. So how are we going to get a hold of this? How are we going to arrest this? Well, we're going to arrest this by getting a hold of our mind and making sure that we manage our mind.
And the enemy always wants to attack us in our minds.
Absolutely. That's where the attack comes first. He brings sexual temptation across our mind. We think of something, we think of someone, or we see something. And I'm talking to guys here. The battle for temptation, it always starts with the mind, and what you are putting into your mind is so important. So I'm going to say this: be really careful what you put in front of your eyes. Be really careful what you put into your ears, what you're watching on TV, what you're looking at on Netflix, what you're checking out on social media. If you are clicking on somebody's profile and then going into those pictures and looking at things, because a lot of times there's things in front of us. If we're constantly putting lustful and trashy and obscene things in front of our eyes, then that's the type of person that you will be drawn towards. And that's the kind of person that eventually, it's hard to say this, but that's the kind of person eventually you'll become. So be very careful what you're putting in front of your eyes, what you're putting into your ears, because it will trickle down into your marriage, and it will potentially lead you to the place of falling into sexual sin.
And cause you to be easily snared.
Absolutely. So I know we've talked about a lot of different things today. You got to get a hold of your mind. Be careful what you're putting in front of your eyes. Be careful what you're putting in your ears. And then here's the last thing that as we wrap this podcast up today, is you got to learn to, and I heard somebody say this years ago, minimize the opportunity. And that is huge. If you don't want to be tempted, then stay away from temptation.
I agree. And most affairs, we've talked about this, occur between like close friends, coworkers, or even family members. And I do think that there are some things that we can do to protect ourselves from falling into sin, because especially, you've been talking to the men. I want to kind of address the women a little bit, if that's okay.
Go for it.
I think a lot of times women, we can get caught into a situation where, say, we have, I don't know, maybe a coworker or someone of the opposite sex begin to want to tell us all about their marital problems.
Yeah.
That can be a snare that you could easily step into. So you need to guard your heart in that.
Well, the crazy part is, a lot of times it'll feed into, well, I want to be compassionate towards this person. I don't want to offend them by,
right. I don't want to hurt their feelings.
Don't want to hurt their feelings.
They think I don't care about them, but you have to be very protective and guard your heart from that, and say, maybe I'm not the person that you should be talking to about these things.
Well, I think let's go in this direction. If it's somebody of the opposite sex wanting to share their marital issues with you, you need to check out of that. That right there is a big red flag. Now, I get it. Somebody's walking through something that is difficult within their life. Let them know, hey, look, this is so-and-so, introduce them to another lady and say, maybe you can talk to them. Or I know I have a counselor friend, maybe you can talk with them. Because when you are talking with somebody about of the opposite sex about your marital issues, that's always a huge red flag.
And two, I think women, we need to be really careful not to go fishing for compliments, from say men in the workplace, and we don't want to in any way give the wrong impression, you know, maybe even inappropriate eye contact, something like that, and especially stay away from social media interaction with, say, an old boyfriend or something of that effect.
We actually have a rule.
Oh, right. We don't friend.
We don't friend ex-boyfriends or girlfriends.
We don't talk on social media. We don't direct message anyone.
Yeah.
That
well, ex-boyfriends and girls.
Ex-boyfriends.
We do message people on social media, but but I remember whenever Facebook first came out, and we were, all of a sudden we're getting all these friend requests, and we're getting all these friends,
and you want to connect with everybody from way back in high school.
You do, and unfortunately, I can tell you that I have talked with people throughout the years that they fell into issues within their marriage because they connected with an old high school flame. And even if nothing happened, it caused jealousy within their marriage. It caused problems within their marriage. So stay away from that. Don't get caught up in that. I like what you're talking about don't go fishing for compliments, because think about this. It makes you feel great whenever somebody says something to you that is complimentary to you. Ladies, maybe you're wearing a new outfit. Guys, maybe you've been working out and you've lost a few pounds. I don't know. But somebody says something to you. But if you're walking around in that new outfit, like, what do you think of this? And you're fishing for compliments, it opens the door for people to be able to flirt with you.
So you need to safeguard.
Yeah.
Put these things into practice to safeguard.
So stay away from that. It's always a red flag, and it's something that you definitely need to safeguard against.
Do what you can to protect your marriage at any cost from sexual sin.
So let's talk about the social media aspect again, because this is an area that is a big, major issue, and this is new on the scene. I mean, social media has only been around for, 10, 15 years, something like that. People are connecting with people that they haven't seen for years, and it's always great. I mean, I have an old high school friend. He messaged me about something, and I messaged him back, and next thing you know, we're talking about hunting, and it's kind of like I hadn't talked to this dude in 30 years, but it was great to be able to reconnect. Well, think of this. Maybe that first love you had in high school, all of a sudden they reach out with a friend request for you, and and you get a little flutter inside your heart. And you're like, whoa, I felt this towards that person. But here, let me say this to you. That person is probably 99% chance they're not the same person you knew back in high school. I have actually watched marriages fall apart because somebody got into a conversation which eventually turned into a relationship with somebody they met back in junior high school, and they were an old flame trying to rekindle that flame. And next thing you know, marriage falls apart, or spouse gets angry, and then there's counseling involved because they find out that there were conversations. What is the devil doing? He's using that to try to bring destruction into a marriage and into a family. So don't go there. Don't fall for that. Be very cautious on social media. We have rules that we laid down in the early days of social media. We will not friend any exes. We will not interact with any exes. We are very open with each other on social media. A lot of times she's tagging me. A lot of times I'm tagging her, which honestly, I don't. Usually when I tag you, I have to come get help because I don't know how to do all that. I'm not that,
You're not that tech savvy.
Yeah, I'm just not that tech savvy. But we lay down some rules early on. And I'm just going to tell you, you got to be really, really careful in regards to that. So use caution there. Because it is so easy to get that flutter inside your heart, and then the enemy starts messing with your mind. Remember, we were talking about that a few minutes ago. The enemy starts messing with your mind, and you start thinking about the what ifs. You start thinking about the shortcomings within your marriage, and your mind can wander quickly. So you got to manage your mind, got to get a hold of your mind, got to build your marriage, and you've got to minimize the opportunities in front of you.
I agree.
Here's another one. Watch out for the lingering stare.
Okay.
Because think about this. You're at the office or you're at church. There's one that a lot of people don't want to talk about. And maybe you're sitting there and you see somebody who is attractive. You look at them, you stare at, there's this lingering stare, and then they turn and look at you. Stay away from that. Give yourself, a mindset of 3 seconds. I'm going to look at somebody for 3 seconds and look away. I don't know. Just coming up with that on the cuff. But watch out for that, because next thing you know, you make eye contact, you get that little flutter inside your heart. And I would say this: if you get that flutter inside your heart, time for a heart check.
Oh, I
Time for a
agree.
heart check and ask God, okay, change me. Give me eyes only for my wife. Give me eyes only for my husband. So watch out for that. Here's another one. Watch out for a lingering touch. Because, you shake a hand, you pat somebody on the shoulder, whatever. You do not want to be a creeper. You do not want to be the type of person who lays your hand on their shoulder and leaves it there, because you don't want to open the door for any what ifs. So watch out for that stuff, because the devil will take full advantage of it. So social media, be careful. Lingering stare, lingering touch, your mindset, all of these different things. I like what you said. Don't go fishing for comments, because Paul also says in Ephesians 5 that there should not even be a hint of sexual immorality amongst us. What does that mean? That it means as husbands, as wives, as Christians, we should not want a hint of any type of sexual immorality within our life. So watch out for sexual temptation. The enemy knows what buttons to push within your life, and he will push those buttons and cause issues within your marriage, within your family, within your life. So be very careful. So you have anything else you want to add as we wrap this up today?
That's a lot of information, and I do hope that our listeners are taking it to heart and that we safeguard and protect our marriages.
Yeah, and I hope that this has helped you guys out today. We don't want to open up a can of worms. I do want to say this once again, that if this has been an issue within your life, maybe you are looking at things that you shouldn't be looking at. Maybe there's some issues going on within your heart, or maybe you have stepped outside of the marriage. Then here's what I'm going to tell you. There is still hope for your marriage. Don't ever get to the place where you think that this cannot work. I have watched time after time after time marriages being healed because they stepped out and got the proper help. They got counsel. And so I would tell you, sit down with your pastor, sit down with a professional counselor, and begin to work on the marriage and build the marriage, because there is hope for your marriage. And so with that said, hope this has been helpful for you guys. I know we talked about a topic today that a lot of people are uncomfortable with, but honestly, I think it's a topic that needs to be dealt with. If you're going to safeguard your marriage from sexual temptation, if you're going to safeguard your marriage from affairs, then these are things that need to be talked about. So thank you today for being a part of Love Like Crazy. If you have liked what you've heard today, then like, subscribe, and share. Help us get the word out about this podcast. And thank you so much for being a part of this podcast today. Until next time, I'm Jay.
And I'm Stacy.
And this is Love Like Crazy.